Good morning. In this session, we're going to turn to the minutes of the 1803 Methodist Conference. They began in 1744 as a kind of a think tank of Wesley's associates, the preachers and the leaders of his various societies around the country who could make themselves available, and hundreds did, to support him, also to encourage him and encourage the development. So he was very much the kingpin of everything that happened there. It happened under his purview. But in 1791, he died and the leadership changed. And his ambiguity, you might call it, about women preaching arrived at a new, in the context of a new age, well, a new context, really. Here it is. So I should say 44. Doesn't looks like 14, doesn't it? There it is, 1803 at the Wesleyan Conference office, published by John Mason. Okay, so they made a decision at those in the 1803 Methodist Conference to limit, but in practice to effectively ban women from public preaching within the Wesleyan connections. And that's a turning point in the whole history of Methodism in this way, that the charismatic experiential ethos of the 18th century confronted the imperatives of institutional consolidation. Things just had to settle down and reach an acceptable norm. So some things had to be sorted out. And any carefree ambiguities that Wesley might have entertained have to be now nailed down. So the movement that he founded began to transform from a fluid movement, like a river, into a canal. And this ruling stated that women ought not to preach. Why? Why? Because, quote, a vast majority of our people are opposed to it, and male preachers were deemed sufficient. That crystallized this massive shift. Now, in the first phase of Methodism, women played visible and, for the movement's theology, theologically justified roles as exhorters and occasional preachers. And Wesley, as we've seen, a little reluctantly and within limits, but he recognized the extraordinary call of people such as Mary Bosanquet Fletcher and Sarah Crosby, permitting some women to preach publicly, and shaping a practice in which the gift of the person was central rather than peripheral. Now, this ruling in 1803 marked a move away from this charismatic inclusivity towards an ecclesiastical professionalism. The people who constituted Methodism were changing. They were growing progressively more middle class, and they sought respectability and coherence with emerging Protestant norms of clerical authority, and it drew tighter lines around what was acceptable as as a minister, and the spontaneity, the kind of free for all that had legitimized women's participation through conversion testimonies, exhortations, and preaching suddenly became suspicious because it threatened the authority. These were all men at the conferences. It was male led, and the whole emerging system of leaders around the country and internationally was suddenly under threat. It's a typical act of patriarchal control. And in effect, the decision of 1803 reconfigured charisma as disorder, a threat to orthodoxy and unity, rather than a valid expression of the Spirit's work in the body. So the tension was not quite about gender, or not simply about gender. it reveals rather how authority was being institutionalized. In the early societies, authority was often charismatic. It was derived from spiritual gifting, which was recognized within the small group networks and sanctioned by Wesley's trust in individual callings, like Mary Fletcher. After his death, things came a little heavier. Institutional authority became more juridical and managerial, less like a family, more like a business. And they made centralized decisions, subscription to rules, hierarchical control. Those things replaced the fluid recognition of charismatic gifts. Women's preaching, unconstrained by formal ecclesiastical ordination, became a casualty of this transformation. So this shouldn't be regarded as total or uncontested. But this became the primary stream within Methodism. But Wesleyanism, the Wesleyan tradition, was wider than that. There were other strands of English Methodism and increasingly North American Methodism, such as the primitive Methodists and the Bible Christians, that continued to sanction women's preaching and itinerancy and refused to restrict ministry on the basis of gender and critiquing this move towards clericalism. And the very existence of these connections underscores that the 1803 ruling was not an inevitable progression, but a contested choice about what Methodist identity would be. We're having this, which means we're not having this. So, in a broader sense, the 1803 ban reflects a pattern familiar across Christian history. You get the institution consolidates, narrows what is legitimate, names it, circles the wagons. This is what we believe. Exclude those whose authority is experienced more directly than mediated by sanctioned office. And the early Methodist women who continued to preach despite official discouragement, they couldn't be stopped, but they persisted, but they found themselves sidelined and shunted off and pushed outside the institutional mainstream. And it's a typical kind of charismatic institutional picture. What do you allow to lead you first? You remember that bit in when Paul is talking about spiritual gifts? He said, let everything be done decently and in order. But that word decently can be translated attractively. There's a kind of a feel about it. But if you're trying to organize stuff, then we tend to have let all things be done decently and order, and you either go one way or the other. You either go to the in order or you go let all things be done. And it seemed like a contest between freedom, charismatic freedom, and institutional business management. So we have a few books here. Chilcote's John Wesley and the Women Preachers, and Jennifer Lloyd's, which starts after this. The phrase persistent preachers. So this situates this post-1803 context within the broader 19th century and how women responded to this pressure, how they navigated exclusion, and how they formed in the end or became part of different connections, of which the Church of the Nazarene eventually was a significant part. Okay, so you'll be able to check these books out. But in sum, this ban can be read not only as a regressive move on gender, but symptomatic of a broader ecclesiological shift from ecstatic gift-centered movement to stabilized denomination, eager to define and to defend the boundaries of authority. And Its legacy is a reminder that institutional consolidation and charismatic spontaneity often exist in a tension within religious traditions, especially when questions of gender and authority and the spirit intersect. Okay, let's leave it there for now. And there's one more session on this series to consider.